So Elias Canetti is really a nutball, and he's an incredible genius. He won the Nobel Prize for this work, Crowds and Power. He won the Nobel Prize for literature for this work, and he really kind of speaking in this vein of Eric Hoffer, and it has to do with extreme conformity and fusion with the group, and like what that does to the personality of the social actor. So, culture and the crowd. I think what Canetti's talking about here is a kind of primal fear. And so the question is, what does man fear most? And this is what Canetti says. He says, there is nothing that man fears more than the touch of the unknown. He wants to see what is reaching towards him and to be able to recognize or at least classify it. Man always tends to avoid physical contact with anything strange. In the dark, the fear of an unexpected touch can mount to panic. Even clothes give insufficient security. It is easy to tear them and pierce through to the naked, smooth, defenseless flesh of the victim. This sounds really weird, and indeed, it's kind of bizarre, but bear with it because, like, this primal fear somehow gets released in the crowd. Like, we don't mind being touched when we're in a crowd of like-minded individuals, and for that reason, the crowd is very dangerous. The particular psychological appeal to the crowd distances itself from what uh, what people fear the most. And again, Kennedy asserts that there's nothing that we fear more than the touch of the unknown. It is only where that many can become free of this fear. Uh, Kennedy says, it's only in a crowd that man can become free of this fear of being touched. That is the only situation in which the fear changes into its opposite. As soon as a man has surrendered himself to the crowd, he ceases to fear its touch. Ideally, all are equal there. No distinctions count, not even that of sex. And so like what Canetti is describing here is this bizarre release from hierarchy and difference in the crowd, and how in a crowd we all meld into one. Right? And so it's what he says again to answer the question. It's only in a crowd that man can become free of this fear of being touched. What happens to distance in a crowd? That is what Kennedy says. He says, man petrifies and darkens in the distances he has created. He drags at that burden of them, but cannot move. He forgets that it is self-inflicted and longs for liberation. But how alone can he free himself? Whatever he does, and however determined he is, he will always find himself among others who thwart his efforts. So long as they hold fast to their distances, he can never come any nearer to them. Only together can men free themselves from their burdens of distance, and this precisely is what happens in a crowd. And so this sounds really weird, but think of like particular crowd experiences which are really incendiary, like when a crowd begins to riot, right? When a crowd which is like a protest crowd turns into a violent crowd. And suddenly, because of this, I don't know, strange conformity, the strange identification, right? Where they're all these all these older norms get released, and so they start, maybe burning and breaking windows, or even worse. I mean, this happens all the time. At like soccer matches with soccer hooliganism in Europe, that the identification of the crowd releases all the old standards and norms. During the discharge, distinctions are thrown off and all feel how. This is what Kennedy says. He says, during the discharge, distinctions are thrown off and all feel equal in that density, where there is scarcely any space between, and body presses against body. Each man is as near the other as he is to himself, and an immense feeling of relief ensues. It is for the sake of this blessed moment when no one is greater or better than another that people become a crowd. The destruction of representational images is the destruction of what? Canetti asserts the destruction of representational images is the destruction of a hierarchy which is no longer recognized. It is the violation of generally established and universally visible and valid distances. The solidity of the images was the expression of their permanence. They seem to have existed forever, upright and immovable. Never before had it been possible to approach them with hostile intent. Now they are hauled down and broken to pieces. And so, like, I think of like when after the the war in Iraq and after Saddam Hussein was deposed and kicked out of power, I remember how like the people hauled down his statue and it kind of broke into pieces, right? The kind of stuff that you would never have done in the older order. It suddenly possible when these, right, with the old representations are destroyable for the first time. In the crowd, why does the individual feel free? In the crowd, the individual feels that he is transcending the limits of his own person. He has a sense of relief, for the distances are removed which used to throw him back on himself and shut him in. With the lifting of these burdens of distance, he feels free. His freedom is the crossing of these boundaries. What is panic? Panic is disintegration of the crowd within the crowd. The individual breaks away and wants to escape from it because the crowd as a whole is endangered. But because he is physically still stuck in it, he must attack it. To abandon himself to it now would be his ruin, because it itself is threatened by ruin. In such a moment, a man cannot insist too strongly on his separateness, hitting and pushing. He evokes hitting and pushing, and the more blows he inflicts and the more he receives, the more himself he feels. The boundaries of his own person become clear to him again. And so, yeah, that it, like during panic, the crowd abandons the crowd. It's everybody for him or herself. Right, terrifying situations. Panic is it must be horrifying. Like a plane when everybody's trying to get off, or a boat, or something like that. What is the stillest crowd? The stillest crowd is the crowd of the enemy dead. The stillest crowd is and so that would be like the vanquished foe. And like during times of war where you'd see like a field of bodies, that is the enemy dead, of which you're victorious because you're still alive. And Canetti says this is like an awesome feeling, right? To be, he does, it will be often retained by that soldier or that individual for the rest of his or her life. What is the stillest crowd? The stillest crowd is the crowd of the enemy dead.